Hi listeners, welcome to my channel The Classic Audiobooks. This channel is for growing interest of all listeners to books that helps you to know about the books and writer as well. We always request you, if you like the audiobook after listening, you must have to buy that book and read for respect to writer and their hard work. And now don't skip, keep listening. The Classic Audiobooks represents to you The Glass Palace Part 2, written by Amitav Ghosh. The Glass Palace is a historical novel by Indian writer Amitav Ghosh. The novel is set in Burma, Bengal, India, and Malaya, spans a century from the Third Anglo-Burmese War and the consequent fall of the Konbaung Dynasty in Mandalay, through the Second World War to late 20th century. Through the stories of a small number of privileged families, it illuminates the struggles that have shaped Burma, India and Malaya into the places they are today. I also so excited to engage in reading season of this book, so let's start. The Glass Palace. Amitav Ghosh Chapter 2. At the palace, a little less than a mile from Macho's stall, the king's chief consort, Queen Supailat, was seen mounting a steep flight of stairs to listen more closely to the guns. The palace lay at the exact center of Mandalay, deep within the walled city, a sprawling complex of pavilions, gardens and corridors all grouped around the nine-roofed HTI of Burma's kings. The complex was walled off from the surrounding streets by a stockade of tall teak posts. At each of the four corners of the stockade was a guard post, manned by sentries from the king's personal bodyguard. It was to one of these that Queen Supailat had decided to climb. The queen was a small, fine-boned woman with porcelain skin and tiny hands and feet. Her face was small and angular, the regularity of its features being marred only by a slight blemish in the alignment of the right eye. The queen's waist, famously of a wisp-like slimness, was swollen by her third pregnancy, now in its 8th month. The queen was not alone. Some half-dozen maidservants followed close behind, carrying her two young daughters, the first and second princesses, Ashinhateksu Faigi and Ashinhateksu Failat. The advanced condition of her pregnancy had made the queen anxious about her children's whereabouts. For the last several days she had been unwilling to allow her two daughters even momentarily out of her sight. The first princess was 3 and bore a striking resemblance to her father, the Bo, King of Burma. She was a good-natured, obedient girl, with a round face and ready smile. The second princess was 2 years younger, not quite 1 yet, and she was an altogether different kind of child, very much her mother's daughter. She'd been born with the colic, and would cry for hours at a stretch. Several times a day she would fly into paroxysms of rage. Her body would go rigid, and she would clench her little fists. Her chest would start pumping, with her mouth wide open but not a sound issuing from her throat. Even experienced nurses quailed when the little princess was seized by one of her fits. To deal with the baby, the queen insisted on having several of her most trusted attendants at hand at all times: Evelyn, Hemau, Augusta, Nan, Pao. These girls were very young, mostly in their early teens, and they were almost all orphans. They'd been purchased by the queen's agents in small Kachin, Wa and Shan villages along the kingdom's northern frontiers. Some of them were from Christian families, some from Buddhist. Once they came to Mandalay, it didn't matter. They were reared under the tutelage of palace retainers, under the queen's personal supervision. It was the youngest of these maids who had had the most success in dealing with the second princess. She was a slender 10-year-old called Dolly, a timid, undemonstrative child with enormous eyes and a dancer's pliable body and supple limbs. Dolly had been brought to Mandalay at a very early age from the frontier town of Lashio. She had no memory of her parents or family. She was thought to be of Shan extraction, but this was a matter of conjecture, based on her slender, fine-boned appearance and her smooth, silken complexion. On this particular morning Dolly had had very little success with the second princess. The guns had jolted the little girl out of her sleep and she had been crying ever since. Dolly, who was easily startled, had been badly scared herself. When the guns had started up, she covered her ears and gone into a corner, gritting her teeth and shaking her head. But then the Queen had sent for her, and after that Dolly had been so busy trying to distract the little princess that she'd had no time to be frightened. Dolly wasn't strong enough yet to take the princess up the steep stairs that led to the top of the stockade. Evelyn, who was 16 and strong for her age, was given the job of carrying her. Dolly followed after the others, and she was the last to step into the guard post, a wooden platform fenced in with heavy timber rails. 4 uniformed soldiers were standing grouped in a corner. The Queen was firing questions at them, but none of them would answer nor even meet her eyes. They hung their heads, fingering the long barrels of their flintlocks. "How far away is the fighting?" the Queen asked. "And what sort of cannon are they using?" The soldiers shook their heads. The truth was that they knew no more than she did. When the noise started, they'd speculated excitedly about its cause. At first they'd refused to believe that the roar could be of human making. Guns of such power had never before been heard in this part of Burma, nor was it easy to conceive of an order of fire so rapid as to produce an indistinguishable merging of sound. The Queen saw that there was nothing to be learned from these hapless men. She turned to rest her weight against the wooden rails of the guard post. If only her body were less heavy, if only she were not so tired and slow. The strange thing was that these last 10 days, ever since the English crossed the border, she'd heard nothing but good news. A week ago a garrison commander had sent a telegram to say that the foreigners had been stopped at Minhala, 200 miles downriver. The palace had celebrated the victory, and the king had even sent the general a decoration. How was it possible that the invaders were now close enough to make their guns heard in the capital? Things had happened so quickly. A few months ago there'd been a dispute with a British timber company, a technical matter concerning some logs of teak. It was clear that the company was in the wrong. They were sidestepping the kingdom's customs regulations, cutting up logs to avoid paying duties. The royal customs officers had slapped a fine on the company, demanding arrears of payment for some 50,000 logs. The Englishmen had protested and refused to pay. They'd carried their complaints to the British governor in Rangoon. Humiliating ultimatums had followed. One of the king's senior ministers, the Kinvu Mingyi, had suggested discreetly that it might be best to accept the terms, that the British might allow the royal family to remain in the palace in Mandalay on terms similar to those of the Indian princes, like farmyard pigs, in other words, to be fed and fattened by their masters, swine, housed in sties that had been tricked out with a few little bits of finery. The kings of Burma were not princes, the Queen had told the Kinvu Mingyi. They were kings, sovereigns. They defeated the emperor of China, conquered Thailand, Assam, Manipur. And she herself, Supailat. She had risked everything to secure the throne for the boy, her husband and stepbrother. Was it even imaginable that she would consent to give it all away now? And what if the child in her belly were a boy, and this time she was sure it was? How would she explain to him that she had surrendered his patrimony because of a quarrel over some logs of wood? The Queen had prevailed, and the Burmese court had refused to yield to the British ultimatum. Now, gripping the guard post rail, the Queen listened carefully to the distant gunfire. She'd hoped at first that the barrage was an exercise of some kind. The most reliable general in the army, the Sultan at Wingun, was stationed at the fort of Mayangan, 30 miles away, with a force of 8,000 soldiers. Just yesterday the king had asked, in passing, how things were going on the war front. She could tell that he thought of the war as a faraway matter, a distant campaign, like the expeditions that had been sent into the Shan Highlands in years past to deal with bandits and dacoits. Everything was going as it should, she told him. There was nothing to worry about. And so far as she knew, this was no less than the truth. She'd met with the senior-most officials every day, the Kinvu Mingyi, the Tengda Mingyi, even the Wingius and Wundoks and Mayavans. None of Them had so much as hinted that anything was amiss. But there was no mistaking the sound of those guns. What was she going to tell the king? Now, the courtyard beneath the stockade filled suddenly with voices. Dolly stole a glance down the staircase. There were soldiers milling around below, dozens of them, wearing the colors of the palace guard. One of them spotted her and began to shout, "The queen! Is the queen up there?" Dolly stepped quickly back, out of his line of sight. Who were these soldiers? What did they want? She could hear their feet on the stairs now. Somewhere close by, the princess began to cry in short, breathless gasps. Augusta thrust the baby into her arms. "Here, Dolly, here, take her, she won't stop." The baby was screaming, flailing her fists. Dolly had to turn her face away to keep from being struck. An officer had stepped into the guard post. He was holding his sheathed sword in front of him in both hands, like a scepter. He was saying something to the queen, motioning to her to leave the cabin, to go down the stairs into the palace. "Are we prisoners then?" The queen's face was twisted with fury. "Who has sent you here?" "Our orders came from the Tengda-Mingyi," the officer said. "For your safety, Mabia, our safety." The guard post was full of soldiers, and they were herding the girls towards the steps. Dolly glanced down. The flight of stairs was very steep. Her head began to spin. "I can't," she cried. "I can't." She would fall, she knew it. The princess was too heavy for her, the stairs were too high, she would need a free hand to hold on, to keep her balance. "Move." "I can't." She could hardly hear herself over the child's cries. She stood still, refusing to budge. Quickly, quickly. There was a soldier behind her. He was prodding her with the cold hilt of his sword. She felt her eyes brimming over, tears flooding down her face. Couldn't they see she would fall, that the princess would tumble out of her grip? Why would no one help? Quick! She turned to look into the soldier's unsmiling face. "I can't. I have the princess in my arms, and she's too heavy for me. Can't you see?" No one seemed to be able to hear her above the princess's wails. "What's the matter with you, girl? Why are you standing there? Move." She shut her eyes and took a step. And then, just as her legs were starting to give way, she heard the queen's voice. "Dolly, stop. It's not my fault." She began to sob, her eyes pressed tightly shut. Someone snatched the princess from her arms. "It's not my fault. I tried to tell them, they wouldn't listen." "It's all right." The queen's voice was sharp but not unkind. "Come on. Down now. Be careful." Weeping in relief, Dolly stumbled down the steps and across the courtyard. She felt the other girl's hands on her back, leading her down a corridor. Most of the buildings in the palace complex were low wooden structures, linked by long corridors. The palace was of relatively recent construction, just 30 years old. It was closely modeled on the royal residences of earlier Burmese capitals at Avar and Amarapura. Parts of the royal apartments had been transported whole after the founding of Mandalay. But many of the smaller outlying buildings were unfinished and still unknown, even to the palace's inhabitants. Dolly had never before been in the room she was led to now. It was dark, with damp plastered walls and heavy doors. "Bring the Tengda-Mingyi to me," the queen was screaming at the guards. "I will not be kept prisoner. Bring him to me, right now." An hour or two went slowly by. The girls could tell from the direction of the shadows under the door that morning had changed into afternoon. The little princess cried herself out and fell asleep across Dolly's crossed legs. The doors were thrown open and the Tengda-Mingyi came puffing in. "Where is the king?" "He is safe, Mabia." He was a stout man with oily skin. In the past he'd always been ready with advice, but now the queen could not get a single clear answer out of him. "The king is safe. You should not worry." The long, drooping hairs that sprouted from his moles shook gently as he smiled and showed his teeth. He produced a telegram. "The Hulton Atwinwum has won a famous victory at Mayangan. But those were not our guns I heard this morning. The foreigners have been halted. The king has dispatched a medal and decorations for the men. He handed her a sheet of paper. She didn't bother to look at it. She had seen many telegrams over the last 10 days, all filled with news of famous victories. But the guns she'd heard that morning were not Burmese, of this she had no doubt. Those were English guns, she said. I know they were. Don't lie to me. How close are they? When do you think they will reach Mandalay? He wouldn't look at her. Maybe's condition as delicate. She should rest. Now. I will return later. Rest. The queen pointed to her maids, sitting on the floor. The girls are exhausted. Look. She pointed to Dolly's red eyes and tear-streaked face. Where are my other servants? Send them to me. I need them. The Tengda Mingi hesitated and then bowed. Maybe they will be here. The other maids arrived an hour later. Their faces were somber. The queen said nothing until the guards had shut the doors. Then everyone clustered tightly around the new arrivals. Dolly had to crane her head to catch what they were saying. This was what they said: the British had destroyed the fort at Mayangan with immaculate precision, using their cannon without losing a single soldier of their own. The Halton at Winwoon had surrendered. The army had disintegrated. The soldiers had fled into the mountains with their guns. The Kinwu Mingi and the Tengda Mingi had dispatched emissaries to the British. The two ministers were now competing with one another to keep the royal family under guard. They knew the British would be grateful to whoever handed over the royal couple. There would be rich rewards. The foreigners were expected to come to Mandalay very soon to take the king and queen into captivity. The invasion proceeded so smoothly as to surprise even its planners. The imperial fleet crossed the border on November 14, 1885. 2 days later, after a few hours of shelling, British soldiers took possession of the Burmese outposts of Nyaungbinmo and Singbaungwe. The next day, at Minhla, the fleet came under heavy fire. The Burmese garrison at Minhla was a small one, but it resisted with unexpected tenacity. The British forces were armed with the latest breech-loading rifles. Their artillery support consisted of 27 rapid-firing machine guns, more than had ever before been assembled on the continent of Asia. The Burmese could not match this firepower. After an exchange of fire that lasted several hours, the British infantry was sent ashore. There were some 10,000 soldiers in the British invasion force, and of these the great majority, about 2/3, were Indian sepoys. Among the units deployed at Minhla there were 3 battalions of sepoys. They were from the Hazara Regiment and the 1st Madras Pioneers. The Indians were seasoned, battle-hardened troops. The Hazaras, recruited from the Afghan border, had proved their worth to the British over decades of warfare, in India and abroad. The 1st Madras Pioneers were among the most loyal of Britain's foot soldiers. They had stood steadfastly by their masters even through the uprising of 1857, when most of northern India had risen against the British. The Burmese defenders of Minhla stood little chance against these sepoys, with their newly manufactured British equipment and their vastly superior numbers. The dogged little defense force dissolved when the redoubt was charged. The aftershock of the collapse of Minhla was felt a long way upriver. At Pakokul the garrison melted away. At Nyaungu, near the great pagoda-covered plain of Pagan, Burmese gunners spiked their own cannon after firing a few shots. At Maijingan, which was under the command of The Halton at Winwoon, the defenders were forced to abandon their positions after a bombardment that lasted several hours. A few days later, without informing King Dabor, the Burmese army surrendered. The war lasted just 14 days. Chapter 3. For 2 days after the bombardment of Mayangan, Mandalay was, strangely, almost eerily quiet. Then the rumors started. One morning, a man went running through the marketplace, past Macho's stall. He was shouting at the top of his voice. Foreign ships had anchored off the shore. English soldiers were marching towards the city. Panic struck the market. People began to run and jostle. Rajkumar managed to push his way through the crowd to the adjoining road. He Could not see far, a cloud of dust hung over the road, drummed up by hundreds of racing feet. People were running in every direction, slamming against each other and pushing blindly at anything that came their way. Rajkumar was swept along in the direction of the river. As he ran, he became aware of a ripple in the ground beneath him, a kind of drumbeat in the earth, a rhythmic tremor that traveled up his spine through the soles of his feet. The people in front of him scattered and parted, pushing up against the sides of the road. Suddenly he was in the front rank of the crowd, looking directly at two English soldiers mounted on brown horses. The cavalrymen were waving people away with drawn swords, clearing the road. The dust had made patterns on their polished boots. Looming behind them was a solid mass of uniforms, advancing like a tidal wave. Rajkumar darted to the side of the road and pressed himself against a wall. The crowd's initial nervousness melted as the first squad of soldiers marched past with their shouldered rifles. There was no rancor on the soldiers' faces, no emotion at all. None of them so much as glanced at the crowd. "The English," someone said, and the words went quickly from mouth to mouth, growing louder and louder until they became a kind of murmured cheer. But as the vanguard passed and the next squad came into view, an amazed silence descended on the spectators. These soldiers were not English, they were Indians. The people around Rajkumar stirred, as though moved to curiosity by the sight of an Indian in their midst. "Who are these soldiers?" someone said. "I don't know." It struck Rajkumar suddenly that he hadn't seen any of the usual Indian faces in the bazaar all day, none of the coolies and cobblers and shopkeepers who always came there every day. For a moment this seemed odd. But then he forgot about it and was once again absorbed in the spectacle of the marching sepoys. People began to ask Rajkumar questions. What are these soldiers doing here? Rajkumar shrugged. How was he to know? He had no more connection with the soldiers than did they. A group of men gathered around him, crowding in, so that he had to take a few backward steps. Where do they soldiers come from? Why are they here? I don't know where they come from. I don't know who they are. Glancing over his shoulder, Rajkumar saw that he had backed himself into a blind alley. There were some 7 or 8 men around him. They had pulled up their longias, tucking them purposefully up at the waist. The sepoys were just a short distance away, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. But he was alone in the alley, the only Indian out of earshot. Surrounded by these men who were clearly intent on making him answer for the soldiers' presence. A hand flashed out of the shadows. Taking a grip on his hair, a man pulled him off the ground. Rajkumar swung up a leg and dug it back, aiming his heel at his assailant's groin. The man saw the kick coming and blocked it with one hand. Twisting Rajkumar's head around, he struck him across the face with the back of his fist. A spurt of blood shot out of Rajkumar's nose. The shock of the blow slowed the moment to a standstill. The arc of blood seemed to stop in its trajectory, hanging suspended in the air, brilliantly translucent, like a string of garnets. Then the crook of an elbow took Rajkumar in the stomach, pumping the breath out of him and throwing him against a wall. He slid down, clutching his stomach, as though he were trying to push his insides back in. Then, suddenly, help arrived. A voice rang through the lane. Stop. The men turned around, startled. Let him be. It was Sire John, advancing towards them with one arm in the air, looking oddly authoritative in a hat and coat. Tucked snugly into the palm of his upraised hand was a small, blunt-nosed pistol. The men backed away, slowly, and once they'd gone, Sire John slipped the pistol into his coat pocket. You're lucky I saw you, he said to Rajkumar. Didn't you know better than to be out on the streets today? The other Indians have all barricaded themselves into Haji Ismail's compound at the foot of Mandalay Hill. He held out a hand and helped Rajkumar to his feet. Rajkumar stood up and wiped the blood off his throbbing face. They walked out of the alley together. On the main road soldiers were still marching past. Rajkumar, and Saya John stood side by side and watched the triumphal parade. Presently Saya John said, I used to know soldiers like these. Saya, in Singapore, as a young man, I worked for a time as a hospital orderly. The patients were mainly sepoys like these Indians, back from fighting wars for their English masters. I still remember the smell of gangrenous bandages on amputated limbs, the nighttime screams of 20-year-old boys, sitting upright in their beds. They were peasants, those men, from small countryside villages. Their clothes and turbans still smelt of wood smoke and dung fires. What makes you fight? I would ask them, when you should be planting your fields at home. Money, they'd say, and yet all they earned was a few annas a day, not much more than a dockyard coolie. For a few coins they would allow their masters to use them as they wished, to destroy every trace of resistance to the power of the English. It always amazed me, Chinese peasants would never do this, allow themselves to be used to fight other people's wars with so little profit for themselves. I would look into those faces and I would ask myself, what would it be like if I had something to defend, a home, a country, a family, and I found myself attacked by these ghostly men, these trusting boys. How do you fight an enemy who fights from neither enmity nor anger but in submission to orders from superiors, without protest and without conscience? In English they use a word, it comes from the Bible, evil. I used to think of it when I talked to those soldiers. What other word could you use to describe their willingness to kill for their masters, to follow any command, no matter what it entailed? And yet, in the hospital, these sepoys would give me gifts, tokens of their gratitude, a carved flute, an orange. I would look into their eyes and see also a kind of innocence, a simplicity. These men, who would think nothing of setting fire to whole villages if their officers ordered, they too had a certain kind of innocence. An innocent evil. I could think of nothing more dangerous. Saya, Rajkumar shrugged offhandedly. They're just tools, without minds of their own. They count for nothing. Saya John glanced at him, startled. There was something unusual about the boy, a kind of watchful determination. No excess of gratitude here. No gifts or offerings, no talk of honor with murder in the heart. There was no simplicity in his face, no innocence. His eyes were filled with worldliness, curiosity, hunger. That was as it should be. If you ever need a job, Saya John said, come and talk to me. Just before sunset the occupying troops withdrew from the fort. They carried away cartloads of booty from the palace. To the astonishment of the townsfolk, they left without posting pickets around the fort. For the first time that anyone could remember, the gateways of the citadel stood open and unguarded. The soldiers marched back the way they had come, but through streets that were now empty. As the tramp of their feet faded away, an uneasy quiet descended on the city. Then, with the suddenness of a nighttime eruption in a chicken coop, a group of women burst out of the fort and came racing over the funeral bridge, their feet pounding a drum roll on its wooden surface. Ma Chao recognized some of the women. They were palace servants. She had seen them going in and out of the fort for years, stepping haughtily down the road in their slippered feet, their long ears plucked daintily above their ankles. They were running now, stumbling through the dust, without a thought for their clothes. They were carrying bundles of cloth, sacks, even furniture. Some were bent over like washerwomen on their way to the river. Ma Chao ran out into the street and stopped one of the women. What are you doing? What's happened? The soldiers, they've been looting the palace. We're trying to save a few things for ourselves. The women disappeared and all was quiet again. Presently the shadows around the fort began to stir. There were ripples of activity in the darkness, like the fluttering of moths in the recesses of a musty cupboard. People crept slowly out of the dwellings that surrounded the citadel. Advancing to the walls, they peered distrustfully at the empty guard posts. There were no soldiers anywhere in sight, nor even any sentries from the palace guard. Was it really possible that the gates had been left unguarded? A few people stepped on the bridges, testing the silence. Slowly, walking on the balls of their feet, they began to advance towards the far bank of the 80-foot moat. They reached the other side and went creeping to the gates, holding themselves ready to run back at the slightest check. It was true, the guards and sentries were all gone. The palace was unguarded. The intruders slipped through the gates and vanished into the fort. Macho had been watching undecided, scratching her chin. Now she picked up her sharp-bladed dagger, tucking the wooden handle into her waist. She started towards the funeral bridge. The fort's walls were a blood red smear in the darkness ahead. Rajkumar ran after her, reaching the bridge abreast of a charging crowd. This was the flimsiest of the fort's bridges, too narrow for the mass that was trying to funnel through. A frenzy of jostling broke out. The man beside Rajkumar found himself stepping on air and dropped over the side. A wooden plank flipped up, tipping two women screaming into the moat. Rajkumar was younger than the people around him and lighter on his feet. Slipping through the press of bodies, he went sprinting into the fort. Rajkumar had imagined the fort to be filled with gardens and palaces, richly painted and sumptuously gilded. But the street he now found himself on was a straight and narrow dirt path, lined with wooden houses, not much different from any other part of the city. Directly ahead lay the palace and its 9-roofed spire. He could see the gilded HTI flashing in the darkness. People were pouring down the street now, some carrying flaming torches. Rajkumar caught a glimpse of Macho rounding a corner. In the distance, he sprinted after her, his longi tucked tight around his waist. The palace stockade had several entrances, including doorways reserved for the use of servants and tradespeople. These were set low in the walls, like mouse holes, so that no one could pass through them without bowing. At one of these small doorways Rajkumar caught up again with Macho. The gate was quickly forced. People began to tumble through like water over the lip of a spout. Rajkumar stayed close behind Macho as she elbowed her way to the entrance. She heaved him in and then squeezed through herself. Rajkumar had the impression of having fallen upon a perfumed sheet. Then he rolled over and found that he was lying on a bed of soft grass. He was in a garden, within reach of a sparkling canal. The air was suddenly clear and cool, free of dust. The orientation of the palace's gateways was towards the east. It was from that direction that ceremonial visitors approached, walking down the formal pathway that led to the great glass-tiled pavilion, where the king held court. On the western side of the stockade, the side that was closest to the funeral gate, lay the women's quarters. These were the halls and apartments that now lay ahead of Macho and Rajkumar. Cho picked herself up and hurried, panting, in the direction of a stone archway. The doors of the main chamber of the women's palace lay just beyond, yawning open. People stopped to run their fingers over the doors. Jade-studded panels. A man fell on his knees and began to pound the slats of wood with a rock, trying to knock out the ornaments. Rajkumar ran past, into the building, a couple of steps behind Macho. The chamber was very large and its walls and columns were tiled with thousands of shards of glass. Oil lamps flared in sconces, and the whole room seemed to be aflame, every surface shimmering with sparks of golden light. The hall was filled with a busy noise, a workman-like hum of cutting and chopping, of breaking wood and shattering glass. Everywhere people were intently at work, men and women, armed with axes and da's. They were hacking at gem-studded oak, offering boxes, digging patterned gemstones from the marble floor, using fish hooks to pry the ivory inlays from lacquered Sadaik chests. Armed with a rock, a girl was knocking the ornamental frets out of a crocodile-shaped zither. A man was using a meat cleaver to scrape the gilt from the neck of a song-gag harp, and a woman was chiseling furiously at the ruby eyes of a bronze chinte lion. They came to a door that led to a candlelit anteroom. There was a woman inside. standing by the latticed window in the far corner. Ma Chao gasped. Queen Supilat. The queen was screaming, shaking her fist. Get out of here. Get out. Her face was red, mottled with rage, her fury caused as much by her own impotence as by the presence of the mob in the palace. A day before, she could have had a commoner imprisoned for so much as looking her directly in the face. Today all the city's scum had come surging into the palace and she was powerless to act against them. But the queen was neither cowed nor afraid, not in the least. Ma Chao fell to the floor, her hands clasped over her head in a reverential shiko. Rajkumar dropped to his knees, unable to wrench his gaze away. The queen was dressed in crimson silk, in a loose garment that billowed over her hugely distended stomach. Her hair was piled in lacquered coils on her tiny, delicately shaped head. The ivory mask of her face was scarred by a single dark furrow, carved by a bead of sweat. She was holding her robe plucked above her ankle, and Rajkumar noticed that her legs were encased in a garment of pink silk stockings, an article of clothing he had never seen before. The queen glared at Ma Chao, lying on the floor in front of her. In one hand, Ma Chao was holding a brass candlestand with a chrysanthemum pedestal. The queen lunged at the prostrate woman. Give that to me. Where did you get it? Give it back. Leaning stiffly over her swollen stomach, the queen tried to snatch away the candlestand. Ma Chao eluded her hands, pushing herself backwards, crab-like. The queen hissed at her. Do you know who I am? Ma Chao offered her yet another respectful genuflection. But she would not part with her candlestand. It was as though her determination to cling to her lute was in no way at odds with her wish to render due homage to the queen. Just one day earlier the crime of entering the palace would have resulted in summary execution. This they all knew, the queen and everyone who had joined the mob. But yesterday had passed, the queen had fought and been defeated. What purpose was to be served by giving her back what she had lost? None of those things was hers anymore. What was to be gained by leaving them to the foreigners to take away? Through all the years of the queen's reign the townsfolk had hated her for her cruelty, feared her for her ruthlessness and courage. Now through the alchemy of defeat she was transformed in their eyes. It was as though a bond had been conjured into existence that had never existed before. For the first time in her reign she had become what a sovereign should be, the proxy of her people. Everyone who came through the door fell to the floor in a spontaneous act of homage. Now, when she was powerless to chastise them, they were glad to offer her these tokens of respect. They were glad even to hear her rail at them. It was good that they should shiko and she berate them. Were she meekly to accept her defeat, none would be so deeply shamed as they. It was as though they were entrusting her with the burden of their own inarticulate defiance. Rajkumar's eyes fell on a girl, one of the queen's maids. She was slender and long-limbed, of a complexion that was exactly the tint of the fine Thanaka powder she was wearing on her face. She had huge dark eyes and her face was long and perfect in its symmetry. She was by far the most beautiful creature he had ever beheld, of a loveliness beyond imagining. Rajkumar swallowed to clear his throat, which was suddenly swollen and dry. She was in the far corner of the room with a group of other girls. He began to work his way towards her along the wall. She was an attendant, he guessed, perhaps 9 or 10 years old. He could tell that the bejeweled little girl beside her was a princess. In the corner behind them lay a heap of richly colored clothes and objects of brass and ivory. The girls had evidently been busy salvaging the queen's possessions when they were interrupted by the mob. Rajkumar looked down at the floor and saw a jeweled ivory box lying forgotten in a corner. The box had a gold clasp, and on its sides were 2 small handles, carved in the shape of leaping dolphins. Rajkumar knew exactly what he had to do. Picking the box off the ground, he ran across the room and offered it to the slender little girl. Here. She wouldn't look at him. She turned her head away, her lips moving silently as though in a chant. Take it, said one of the other girls. T's giving it to you. Here. T thrust the box at her again. Don't be afraid. T surprised himself by taking hold of her hand and placing it gently on the box. I brought it back for you. She let her hand rest on the lid. It was as light as a leaf. Her lowered eyes went first to the jeweled blade and then traveled slowly from the dark knots of his knuckles to his torn and dirt-spattered vest and up to his face. And then her eyes clouded over with apprehension and she dropped her gaze. He could tell that her world was ringed with fear, so that every step she took was a venture into darkness. What's your name? Rajkumar said. She whispered a couple of inaudible syllables. Dolly. Dolly. Dolly, repeated Rajkumar. Dolly. He could think of nothing else to say or as much worth saying, so he said the name again louder and louder, until he was shouting, Dolly. Dolly. He saw a tiny smile creep onto her face, and then Macho's voice was in his ear. Soldiers, run. At the door, he turned to look back. Dolly was standing just as he'd left her, holding the box between her hands, staring at him. Macho tugged at his arm. For what are you staring at that girl, you half-wit Kala? Take what you've got and run. The soldiers are coming back. Run. The mirrored hall was echoing with shouts. At the door, Rajkumar turned back to make a gesture at Dolly, more a sign than a wave. I will see you again. Chapter 4. The royal family spent the night in one of the farthest outbuildings in the palace grounds, the South Garden Palace, a small pavilion surrounded by pools, canals and rustic gardens. The next day, shortly before noon, King Dabo came out to the balcony and sat down to wait for the British spokesman, Colonel Sladen. The king was wearing his royal sash and a white gongbang, the turban of mourning. King Dabo was of medium height, with a plump face, a thin moustache, and finely shaped eyes. As a youth he had been famous for his good looks. It had once been said of him that he was the handsomest Burman in the land. He was in fact half Shan, his mother having come to Mandalay from a small principality on the eastern border. He'd been crowned at the age of 20 and in the 7 years of his reign had never once left the palace compound. This long confinement had worked terrible ravages on his appearance. He was only 27 but looked to be well into middle age. To sit on the throne of Burma had never been the boss's personal ambition. Nor had anyone in the kingdom ever imagined that the crown would one day be his. As a child he had entered into the Buddhist boys' customary novitiate in the Minghood with an enthusiasm unusual in one of his birth and lineage. He had spent several years in the palace monastery, leaving it just once, briefly, at the behest of his father, the august King Mindon. The king had enrolled the boy and a few of his stepbrothers in an English school in Mandalay. Under the tutelage of Anglican missionaries, the boy had learned some English and displayed a talent for cricket. But then King Mindon had changed his mind, withdrawing the princes from the school and eventually expelling the missionary. The boy had returned gladly to the monastery on the palace grounds, within sight of the water clock and the relic house of the Buddha's tooth. He had proceeded to earn distinction in scriptural study, passing the difficult Patama by an examination. At the age of 19, King Mindon was perhaps the wisest, most prudent ruler ever to sit on the throne of Burma. Appreciative though he was of his son's gifts, he was equally aware of his limitations. If the boy ever becomes king, he once remarked, the country will pass into the hands of foreigners. But of this, there seemed to be little possibility. There were 46 other princes in Mandalay whose claims to the throne were as good as the boy's. Most of them far exceeded him in ambition and political ability. But fate intervened in the familiar guise of a mother-in-law. The boss happened to be also his stepmother, the Alanando Queen, a senior consort, and a wily and ruthless exponent of palace intrigue. She arranged for the boy to marry all 3 of her daughters simultaneously. Then she shouldered him past his 46 rivals and installed him on the throne. He had no choice but to assent to his accession. To accept was an easier alternative. then to refuse, and less potentially lethal. But there was a startling new development, something that threw everybody's calculations off kilter. The boar fell in love with one of his wives, his middle queen, Supailat. Of all the princesses in the palace, Supailat was by far the fiercest and most willful, the only one who could match her mother in guile and determination. Of such a woman only indifference could have been expected, where it concerned a man of scholarly inclination like the boar. Yet, she too, in defiance of the protocols of palace intrigue, fell headlong in love with her husband, the king. His ineffectual good nature seemed to inspire a maternal ferocity in her. In order to protect him from her family, she stripped her mother of her powers and banished her to a corner of the palace, along with her sisters and co-wives. Then she set about ridding the boar of his rivals. She ordered the killing of every member of the royal family who might ever be considered a threat to her husband. 79 princes were slaughtered on her orders, some of them newborn infants and some too old to walk. To prevent the spillage of royal blood, she had had them wrapped in carpets and bludgeoned to death. The corpses were thrown into the nearest river. The war too was largely of Supailat's making. It was she who had roused the great council of the land, the Liddo, when the British began to issue their ultimatums from Rangoon. The king had been of a mind for appeasement. The Kinvu Mingyi, his most trusted minister, had made an impassioned appeal for peace, and he was tempted to give in. Then Supailat had risen from her place and gone slowly to the center of the council. It was the 5th month of her pregnancy, and she moved with great deliberation. With a slow, shuffling gait, moving her tiny feet no more than a few inches at a time, a small, lonely figure in that assembly of turbaned noblemen. The chamber was lined with mirrors. As she approached its center, an army of Supailats seemed to materialize around her. They were everywhere. On every shard of glass, thousands of tiny women with their hands clasped over their swollen waists. She walked up to the stout old Kinvung Mingyi, sitting sprawled on his stool. Thrusting her swollen belly into his face, she said, "Why, grandfather, it is you who should wear a skirt and own a stone for grinding face powder." Her voice was a whisper, but it filled the room. And now the war was over, and he, the king, was sitting on the balcony of a garden pavilion, waiting for a visit from Colonel Sladen, the spokesman of the conquering British. The evening before, the colonel had called on the king and informed him, in the politest and most discreet language, that the royal family was to be transported from Mandalay the next day, that His Majesty would do well to use the remaining time to make his preparations.